transpired, Greece walked out before the council could formalize the expulsion. In a world grown increasingly hostile, the support of the world's most powerful nation was sine qua non for the Greek junta. The two governments thrived upon each other. Said the American ambassador to Greece, Henry Tosca, "This is the most anti-communist group you'll find anywhere. There is just no place like Greece to offer these facilities with the backup of the kind of government you have got here. You, not we," noted the reporter, "was the only pretense." The facilities the ambassador was referring to were dozens of US military installations, from nuclear missile bases to major communication sites, housing tens of thousands of American servicemen. The United States, in turn, provided the junta with ample military hardware despite an official congressional embargo, as well as the police equipment required by the Greek authorities to maintain their rigid control. In an attempt to formally end the embargo, the Nixon administration asked Papadopoulos to make some gesture towards constitutional government, which the White House could then point to. The Greek prime minister was to be assured, said a secret White House document, that the administration would take at face value and accept without reservation any such gesture. U.S. Vice President Spiro Agnew, on a visit to the land of his ancestors, was moved to exalt the achievements of the Greek government and its constant cooperation with U.S. needs and wishes. One of the satisfied needs Agnew may have had in mind was the contribution of $549,000 made by the junta to the 1968 Nixon-Agnew election campaign. Apart from any other consideration, it was suspected that this was money given to the junta by the CIA finding its way back to Washington. A Senate investigation of this question was abruptly canceled at the direct request of Henry Kissinger. Perhaps nothing better captures the mystique of the bond felt by the Greeks to their American guardians than the story related about Chief Inspector Basil Lambrou, one of Athens' well-known torturers. Hundreds of prisoners have listened to the little speech given by Inspector Basil Lambrou, who sits behind his desk which displays the red, white, and blue clasped hand symbol of American aid. He tries to show the prisoner the absolute futility of resistance. "You make yourself ridiculous by thinking you can do anything. The world is divided in two. There are the communists on that side, and on this side the free world. The Russians and the Americans, no one else. What are we? Americans. Behind me there is the government, behind the government is NATO, behind NATO is the US. You can't fight us, we are Americans." Amnesty International adds that some torturers would tell their victims things like, "The Human Rights Commission can't help you now. The Red Cross can do nothing for you. Tell them all, it will do no good, you are helpless." The torturers from the start, said Amnesty, had said that the United States supported them and that was what counted. In November 1973, a falling out within the Greek inner circle culminated in the ousting of Papadopoulos and his replacement by Colonel Dimitrios Ioannidis, commander of the military police, torturer, graduate of American training in anti-subversive techniques, confidant of the CIA. Ioannidis named as prime minister a Greek-American, A. Androutsopoulos, who came to Greece after the Second World War as an official employee of the CIA, a fact of which Mr. Androutsopoulos had often boasted. 8 months later, the Ioannidis regime overthrew the government of Cyprus. It was a fatal miscalculation. Turkey invaded Cyprus, and the reverberations in Athens resulted in the military giving way to a civilian government. The Greek nightmare had come to an end. Much of the story of American complicity in the 1967 coup and its aftermath may never be known. At the trials held in 1975 of junta members and torturers, many witnesses made reference to the American role. This may have been the reason a separate investigation of this aspect was scheduled to be undertaken by the Greek Court of Appeals. But it appears that no information resulting from this inquiry, if it actually took place, was ever announced. Philip Dean, upon returning to Greece several months after the civilian government took over, was told by leading politicians that, for the sake of preserving good relations with the US, the evidence of US complicity will not be made fully public. Andreas Papandreou had been arrested at the time of the coup and held in prison for 8 months. Shortly after his release, he and his wife Margaret visited the American ambassador, Phillips Talbot, in Athens. Papandreou related the following. "I asked Talbot whether America could have intervened the night of the coup to prevent the death of democracy in Greece. He denied that they could have done anything about it. Then Margaret asked a critical question. What if the coup had been a communist or a leftist coup? Talbot answered without hesitation. Then, of course, they would have intervened, and they would have crushed the coup. 36. Bolivia 1964 to 1975. Tracking down Che Guevara in the land of coup d'etat. Victor Paz Estenssoro was given a choice when he was overthrown by yet another Bolivian military coup. He could be taken, one of the officers told him, either to the cemetery or to the airport. The president opted to fly to Lima and exile. The man who led the coup in November 1964 and replaced Paz was none other than his vice president, General René Barrientos Ortuno. It marked something like the 185th change of government. No one seems certain of the precise number. In Bolivia's 139 years of independence from Spanish rule, very few by-elections. Paz was unseated despite support from the American ambassador, Douglas Henderson, for it happened that both the CIA and the Pentagon wanted the president out. Barrientos, the former commander of the Air Force, had formed a close relationship with both institutions, primarily through the person of Colonel Edward Fox, his flying instructor and drinking companion, dating back to the Bolivians' military training days in the United States. The year 1964 found Fox in the Bolivian capital of La Paz working with the CIA, though listed officially as a military attaché. Not surprisingly, Cuba was one of the sore points between the American colonel and the Bolivian president. Paz had directly opposed American policy by voting against Cuba's expulsion from the Organization of American States in 1962, by declining to join in on the OAS sanctions against the Castro government 2 years later, and by refusing to break diplomatic relations with Havana. It was not until August 1964, when Bolivian-American relations were just short of an open quarrel, that Paz finally broke with the United States bête noire. It was a case of conforming or of facing a severe cut in United States aid, observed a New York Times editorial. The Bolivian government's attempts to attract economic aid and investment from countries other than the United States, such as the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, were a further source of friction between the two countries. Here, too, the Bolivians eventually yielded. Although Fox and Ambassador Henderson were divided, deeply it was said, on the question of Paz remaining in office, both were uneasy about the political and economic power wielded by the tin miners and their leader Juan Lechin, the former vice president who was an open candidate for Paz's job. The miners controlled their own area of the country. They had their own radio station and their own armed militia. They were intensely opposed to the military, and they were seen as a force potentially more radical than the president. A volatile 4-month strike in the mines in mid-1963, which reached crisis proportion, could only have served to ring the alarm bells louder in the American embassy. The Minister of Mines under Paz, René Zavaleta Mercado, later wrote that for over a year and a half, the American embassy, in the form of Mr. Henderson, urged with almost weekly regularity that the army be sent to the mining zones, and threatened that otherwise, an American financial program for the mines would be suspended. Paz recognized the challenge to his own rule posed by the miners and Lechin, but the likely political damage ensuing from an armed intervention was more than he was willing to risk. The very existence of an army to send in owed more than a little to American efforts to rebuild the shattered Bolivian armed forces. In 1952, that rarity had occurred. An armed popular revolt had defeated the military, displaced the oligarchy, nationalized the tin mines, instituted land reform, and set up a new government under the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario. The MNR reduced the military to a small, impotent, and discredited force, at the same time fostering people's militias. Decades of coups and other abuses had cut a wide swathe of anti-military sentiment across the Bolivian population. Despite the entreaties of certain segments of the left, however, the traditional armed forces were not completely dismantled. It proved to be a fatal error for the MNR and the country's fledgling democratic institutions, primarily to serve as a counterweight to the strength of the militias, and because of American pressure, both Paz and his predecessor had permitted, however reluctantly, the slow but certain rejuvenation of the military. Under U.S. guidance, the Bolivian Army became the first in Latin America to launch a civic action program, building roads, schools, etc., designed to improve its image amongst the population. No country in the Western Hemisphere is more dependent on Washington's aid, wrote the New York Times shortly after the coup, and nowhere has the United States Embassy played a more obtrusive role in establishing that fact. Washington employed its potent economic leverage to spur a distinctly more favorable government policy towards the military, one which allowed the U.S. to professionalize the armed forces. More money followed, more recruits, new equipment. Selected officers were sent to the United States for training. Political indoctrination courses for officers given by MNR adherents and academics were allowed to lapse, and were replaced by indoctrination at the U.S. School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone. By 1964, some 1,200 Bolivian officers and men had received training either in the United States or Panama, including 20 of the 23 senior Army officers. The military had come a long way towards recouping its former size and efficiency, its prestige and its independence. The School of the Americas, observed the Washington Post in 1968, counts so many important Latin officers as alumni that it is known throughout Latin America as the Escuela de Golpes or Coup School. Whether the American motivation for reviving the military derived from a desire for an eventual military takeover is impossible to say. At a minimum, it evidenced a basic distrust of the Bolivian Revolution with its potential for genuine independence from the United States. And, given the country's history, the culmination of the military process would appear to have been plainly inevitable. The Pentagon has long seen the military of Latin America as its natural partners, the proper nation builders. This conviction was spelled out by Colonel Truman F. Cook of the American Military Assistance Mission in Bolivia in the foreword to a pamphlet on the use of the Army in civic action programs. In the pamphlet, published in Bolivia in 1964 and authored by Bolivian LT Gulaxio Julio Sanjines, a confidant of Pentagon and CIA officers, Cook wrote, "The military organization is perhaps the only institution endowed with the organization, order, discipline, and self-sacrificing attitude towards objectives for the common good. Should political and economic institutions fail, then there is a real possibility that the military would move in against graft and corruption in government. It is naive to assume that they might not move to power in a classic sense." Another unknown is at what point General Barrientos and his co-conspirators actually decided to oust Paz. What is certain is, 1. The general's ascendancy to the office of vice president was a crucial part of the process. 2. The role played by the CIA and the Pentagon in obtaining that office for Barrientos was sine qua non. At the MNR's convention in January 1964, Paz sidestepped Barrientos, who had made his candidacy known, and chose a civilian, Frederico Fortune, to be his running mate. Barrientos proved to be a bad loser. He declared publicly that the nomination was a mistake and continued politicking, finally compelling the president to ask for his resignation as Air Force Chief. The general was given 1 week in which to submit it. A few days later, however, a scenario began to unfold which grabbed Barrientos from the edge of the abyss. On the evening of February 25th, there supposedly took place a shooting attempt on Barrientos' life. Some accounts have the general near death, others only wounded. In either event, it does appear rather incongruous that he was moved by military vehicle to the airport and then flown in a U.S. Air Force plane to an American hospital in the Panama Canal Zone, 2,000 miles away. No Bolivian doctor ever examined Barrientos. In the days following, while Barrientos was still in the hospital following a lengthy operation, he was extolled as a national hero by the press in Bolivia. This was particularly the case with El Diario, an influential, conservative, and strongly anti-Paz newspaper. According to the later testimony of a member of Barrientos' new cabinet, some of the newspaper's staff worked with the CIA. Moreover, one of El Diario's board members was the aforementioned LT Gulaxio Sanjines. Sanjines, a graduate of West Point, was an employee of the U.S. Embassy, working on Alliance for Progress programs. After the coup, he was appointed Minister of Economics, later ambassador to Washington. The press coverage included the story that Barrientos' life was spared only because the bullet had struck the U.S. Air Force Silver Wings, which he wore on his uniform. This became the Silver Bullet affair, and great sympathy was generated for the courageous general. On top of this, notes one historian of Bolivia, the commander of the army and the political opposition, hinted publicly that Paz's police had been responsible for the alleged attack. Strong pressures from other high officers as well were exerted upon Paz to vindicate both himself and Barrientos by belatedly including the general on the ticket, and Paz felt he could not refuse. 10 days after the mysterious incident, the president dumped Fortune, replaced him with Barrientos, and went on to re-election. Barrientos himself later conceded that without the silver bullet, or magic bullet, as others dubbed it, he would never have become vice president. His 8 months as candidate and as vice president in office served, in turn, to tie up all the loose ends required for the military to return from 12 years in the political wilderness and stage their coup with a minimum of opposition, indeed with a measure of support. Barrientos' ascendancy furnished a distinct legitimacy to the military, and the general regularly used his platform to champion the armed forces and defend it against the deep-seated anti-militarism. He denounced the militias, called for their dissolution, and took the anomalous step of undermining the government of which he was the vice president, or to be, by publicly reproaching the president and the MNR, particularly when they were critical of the military, and by throwing his support to anti-government groups. These tactics served to show up the president's weakness and succeeded in rallying to Barrientos' side many of the military officers who had been dubious about the wisdom or safety of re-entering the political arena and unsure of their own political muscle. It appears that little, if anything further, was heard of Barrientos' injury, although during this period he miraculously escaped several other reported assassination attempts, including a bomb which blew up his car when no one was in it and another bomb which somehow found its way to under his bed. He used the latter occasion to declare that he had more enemies within the MNR than in the ranks of the opposition. Paz Estenssoro had been re-elected because the opposition, claiming, amongst other things, unfair electoral procedure, had decided to abstain. Without pausing for breath, the masochistic, tangled mess that is Bolivian politics continued at his throat. In October, the vice president withdrew to his hometown and declared himself a rebel. This period of public chaos and government crisis may have hastened the timing of the coup, at the same time convincing some still reluctant officers who were disgusted by the constant civilian warfare. When the military finally made its move against Paz at the beginning of November, it was not unwelcomed by various segments of the population. 3 years later, the Washington Post's veteran Latin America correspondent, John Gashko, reported that Paz still insists that Fox was behind his ouster. Among Bolivians with an awareness of politics, it is hard to find anyone who disagrees. René Barrientos pressed an unrelenting hard line against the tin miners. He inflicted upon them an extraordinary 50% cut in salary. Miners' boss Juan Lechin and other union and MNR leaders were ordered into exile, and a principal labor confederation was banned. All Bolivian unions were directed to reorganize under guidelines designed to produce an apolitical labor movement. Then the army moved in. Repeated invasions and occupations of the mining camps over a period of time were needed to pacify the ultramilitant miners. The fighting was bloody, 70 miners losing their lives in one raid alone. La Noche de San Juan, as it came to be known. The revolution of 1952 had come to an end. The United States was not a disinterested observer. In February 1966, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, presenting his department's regular assessment of the international situation, told a congressional committee, "Violence in the mining areas and in the cities of Bolivia has continued to occur intermittently, and we are assisting this country to improve the training and equipping of its military forces." This was all that the defense secretary had to report about Bolivia, a routine report routinely written by some faceless Pentagon researcher, routinely delivered by the quintessential technocrat, as if the American action was the most natural and innocuous thing in the world. As natural as American financial contributions to Barrientos. Antonio Argudas, Minister of the Interior under Barrientos, later disclosed that the CIA contributed $600,000 to the Bolivian leader in 1966 when he decided to hold an election. Several right-wing parties received lesser sums. Argudas, an admitted agent of the CIA who, in 1968, gave the world Che Guevara's diary, claiming that the agency had pushed him too hard, also revealed that Gulf Oil Corporation donated $200,000 to Barrientos' campaign, as well as a helicopter for his tours around the provinces. Gulf subsequently admitted that it had paid Bolivian officials, mainly Barrientos, a total of $460,000 in political contributions during the period 1966 to 69 at the CIA's recommendation, although the company may have needed but little prodding, for the Bolivian president had opened up the economy to multinationals to a greater degree than his predecessors, bestowing upon Gulf especially generous concessions. In the 2 years following the disappearance of Che Guevara from public view in early 1965, rumors had placed him at different times in the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Guatemala, the Congo, which was true, China, Vietnam, and even New York, always plotting revolution with some menacing and inscrutable bunch of desperados. Word also had it that he had gone mad and was confined to an asylum somewhere, or that he had been imprisoned or executed by his erstwhile comrade-in-arms Fidel Castro for challenging Castro's authority. These latter stories, or others like them, may well have been CIA handiwork. The agency, ever inventive, had begun generating unfavorable press speculation about Guevara's disappearance as early as autumn 1965 in the hope that he would reappear in order to put an end to the tales. When evidence began to drift back to CIA headquarters in early 1967 that Che was leading a band of guerrillas in the southern mountains of Bolivia, there was understandable skepticism amongst some agency officials. Nevertheless, obsessed as the CIA was with tracking down the legendary guerrilla, a multi-phased operation was put into motion. In April, American military supplies suitable for combating guerrilla forces began to arrive in Bolivia. Light arms, communication equipment, helicopters, etc. At the end of the month, a unit of 16 Green Berets was dispatched from Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone to Bolivia to provide on-the-spot training in counterinsurgency tactics to a hand-picked battalion of Bolivian Rangers who had little or no experience in the real thing. The Green Berets had at their disposal a team of experts in communications, intelligence, and reconnaissance work, and, before long, aerial photographs taken of approximately 23,500 square miles of southern Bolivia. This undertaking made use of an infrared detection system, sensitive to thermal radiation rather than visible light, and as such could be employed at night and on cloudy days. The infrared cameras were able to discriminate targets having less than 1 degree temperature difference with their background, thus picking up campfires, vehicles, even people, or so the technocrats would have one believe. In any event, the guerrillas rarely built fires or used vehicles. In La Paz, the CIA station informed Interior Minister Argudas that it was sending him several advisors, whose presence was required, it was stated, because of the ineffectiveness of Bolivia's intelligence services. A few days later, according to Argudas, for Cuban exiles arrived and assumed their advisory positions in his ministry. One of them proceeded to set up 2 houses of interrogation where Bolivians suspected of aiding the guerrillas were brought for questioning. When Argudas learned of this, and that in some cases the Cubans were resorting to torture, he was furious and demanded that the CIA put a stop to the operation. Other Cuban CIA agents were attached to the military high command and sent to the area of guerrilla fighting to collect detailed information from prisoners and peasants. This kind of investigation probably contributed more to locating the elusive Guevara than did the CIA's assortment of technological marvels, although the ultimate value of the agency's role cannot be stated with any precision. What is clear, however, is that it was a case of overkill. Che's guerrilla movement never amounted to much of a threat. Barely more than 50 men and 1 woman at its peak, reduced to less than half that number at the end, the rebels could show to their credit only a scattering of skirmishes with the army. They had been largely ignored by the left in Bolivia and hardly swam like fish in the peasant sea. The inhabitants of this region, wrote Che in his diary, are as impenetrable as rocks. You speak to them, but in the deepness of their eyes you can see that they do not believe you. As in the Congo, this man who made social revolution his life had failed to win over the peasantry. You can waken men, said Alexander Herzen a century ago in Russia, only by dreaming their dreams more clearly than they can dream them themselves. On October 8, 1967, Che Guevara was captured. The next day, the Bolivian government ordered his execution in cold blood to prevent him from becoming the object of a worldwide clemency campaign, and despite the vociferous objections of CIA men in the country who clung to the hope that Guevara would eventually talk openly about his sundry guerrilla adventures. Following the death of René Barrientos in April 1969, crashing in Gulf's helicopter, Bolivia's statesmen soon reverted to their normal Byzantine convolutions. For a start, the vice president who succeeded Barrientos lasted but 5 months before being ousted by General Alfredo Ovando Candia. Ovando's long-held nationalist sentiments came to the fore. In his first month, he nationalized the Gulf Oil Corporation. The prevailing attitude toward the multinational, said Bolivian leaders, was that Gulf constituted itself as a shadow government of vast powers over a poor land. The nationalization left Bolivia open, as the New York Times expressed it in December, to the wrath of the United States. Since the seizure, the United States, which has been the mainstay of Bolivia's economy for years, has indicated that further aid will not be forthcoming. Washington has not been impressed by Bolivia's offer to compensate Gulf for the property, which is valued at $140 million, about 50% more than Bolivia's annual budget. Two Bolivian cabinet ministers interviewed this week said privately that the United States and Argentina were aware, as were most educated people in this capital, that well-financed groups were plotting to overthrow the new Bolivian regime. This was followed by a dispatch from La Paz of Interpress Service, a major Latin American news agency, reporting that the United States was planning to bring down the Ovando government through economic strangulation. Then, 2 days later, the government alerted the public about a conspiracy that was being organized by the CIA in close collaboration with Gulf Oil and some Bolivian rightists. What fire all the smoke pointed to is not known. Ovando, who had walked the corridors of the Bolivian power structure for many years, it was he who had presented Paz with the choice of cemetery or airport, was no stranger to CIA intrigue in his country, and he may have seen the bright spotlight of publicity as the only means of forestalling his overthrow. This would also explain why, in January 1970, the government made it a point to announce the ordinary, that it had uncovered a CIA office in La Paz with radio transmission and bugging equipment. The same month, Ovando also advocated a rapprochement with Cuba, and it looked like he and the CIA were on a collision course. But then, it seems, someone got to Ovando with an offer he couldn't refuse. Slowly but surely, the president drifted to the right, amongst other indications. Several anti-US student demonstrations were firmly put down by the police. Nothing more was heard about Cuba, and Ovando removed General Juan Jose Torres as commander of the armed forces, a man highly regarded by most of the Bolivian left. By September, matters had progressed to the point that State Department officials were publicly expressing concern that a deepening split between the Ovando government and its former leftist allies was on the brink of open showdown and might result in a communist government. By whatever label, there was indeed fresh political conflict in Bolivia. 2 weeks later, the power struggle erupted into a military revolt. General Ovando was out. General Torres was in. Ovando had lasted 1 year. Juan Jose Torres's 10 months in office produced the archetypical Latin American political drama. In the opening act, Torres did all the things which make Washington officials see red. He made overtures of friendship to Allende's Chile and Castro's Cuba, increased commercial ties with the Soviet Union, nationalized tin mines owned by American interests, leading the US to threaten to release large amounts of its tin stockpile onto the world market to deflate the international price, expelled the Peace Corps, and closed down the Inter-American Regional Labor Organization, ORIT, an important vehicle for CIA labor operations in Latin America. On top of all this, Torres indulged at times in Marxist rhetoric, talking of workers' and peasants' power and the like. Act 2 brought on stage one Hugo Banzer, a Bolivian colonel with long and close ties to the American military establishment. He too had attended the Escuela de Galps in Panama. Later, there was further military training at Fort Hood in Texas. Eventually, a posting to Washington as Bolivian military attaché. Along the way, he picked up the Order of Military Merit from the United States government. Banzer was also reported to be one of the beneficiaries of Gulf Oil's largesse when he served in Barrientos's cabinet. In January 1971, Colonel Banzer led a coup attempt which came to nothing except his own exile to Argentina. The CIA in La Paz had known of Banzer's plan at least 2 weeks earlier and had advised Washington of it. Over the next 6 months, as Banzer and his military cohorts diligently plotted their next attempt to oust Torres, Banzer regularly crossed over the Argentine border into Bolivia, where he was in close contact with U.S. Major Robert London, an advisor to the Bolivian Air Force School in Santa Cruz. Act 3, or the coup that succeeded, took place in August, a few days after Torres had announced an agreement with the Soviet Union for a major development of the Bolivian iron industry, a few days before he was to meet with Salvador Allende to re-establish diplomatic relations with Chile. When the plotters were in military control of Santa Cruz, a breakdown in their radio communications network caused a delay in rallying other Bolivian military units to their side. At this moment, Major London stepped in to fill the breach by placing the U.S. Air Force radio system at the rebels' disposal. How important this aid was to the success of the coup, which turned out to be very bloody, or what London's role was otherwise, has not been determined. 1 week later, the San Francisco Chronicle reported, although it has been officially denied, CIA money, training and advice was liberally given to the rebel strategists who masterminded the overthrow of Bolivia's leftist president, Juan José Torres. In the finale, we find that the military political coalition that took power was so far to the right that one of its member parties called itself by the customary fascist designation Phalange, and that Banzer immediately announced that his government would maintain very close relations with the United States, efforts to restore ties with Cuba and Chile would be abandoned, the trend toward nationalizations would halt, some already completed nationalizations would be rescinded, the government would welcome private foreign investment, and all schools would be closed for at least 4 months because they were hotbeds of political subversive agitation provoked by anarchists opposed to the new institutional order. Before long, the government ordered the entire Soviet embassy to leave the country, and Banzer eventually raised a foreign loan to pay Gulf Oil greatly increased compensation. At the same time, the time-honored scene known popularly as Reign of Terror was performed. Within the first 2 years of the new regime, more than 2,000 persons were arrested for political reasons without being brought to trial. All the fundamental laws protecting human rights were regularly violated. Torture was commonly used on prisoners during interrogation, beaten, raped, and forced to undergo simulated executions, hung for hours with their hands tied behind their backs. By 1975, Catholic religious groups and clergy had taken upon themselves the dangerous burden of speaking out in defense of human rights in Bolivia. The Banzer government responded with a calculated and methodical campaign to divide the church, to isolate its progressive members, harass and censor them, and smear them as communists. Foreign priests and nuns, who made up the bulk of the country's clergy, were especially vulnerable to arrest and deportation. One of them, an American missionary from Iowa, Father Raymond Herman, was found murdered. The CIA, it has been reported, assisted the Bolivian government in this endeavor by providing full information on certain priests, personal data, studies, friends, addresses, writings, contacts abroad, etc. The agency, with its international data network, was particularly valuable concerning the foreign clergy. I will observe the Constitution, said Banzer, whenever it does not contradict military decrees. Since the formulation of the current Bolivian government in August 1971, stated a report of the U.S. Comptroller General's Office in 1975, the objective of U.S. military assistance has been to provide stability and security. To assist in the objective, the United States provides material and training to develop adequate counterinsurgent forces. In 1978, Hugo Banzer was overthrown in yet another Bolivian coup. The new Bolivian strongman, former Air Force General Juan Pereda Aspin, announced, as Banzer had announced, that he was saving the nation from international communism. 37. Guatemala 1962 to 1980s. A less publicized final solution. Indians tell harrowing stories of village raids in which their homes have been burned, men tortured hideously and killed, women raped, and scarce crops destroyed. It is Guatemala's final solution to insurgency. Only mass slaughter of the Indians will prevent them joining a mass uprising. This newspaper item appeared in 1983. Very similar stories have appeared many times in the world press since 1966, for Guatemala's final solution has been going on rather longer than the more publicized one of the Nazis. It would be difficult to exaggerate the misery of the mainly Indian peasants and urban poor of Guatemala, who make up 3/4 of the population of this beautiful land so favored by American tourists. The particulars of their existence derived from the literature of this period sketch a caricature of human life. In a climate where everything grows, very few escape the daily ache of hunger or the progressive malnutrition. Almost half the children die before the age of 5. The leading cause of death in the country is gastroenteritis. Highly toxic pesticides sprayed indiscriminately by airplanes, at times directly onto the heads of peasants, leave a trail of poisoning and death. Public health services in rural areas are virtually non-existent. The same for public education, near total illiteracy. A few hundred families possess almost all the arable land, thousands of families without land, without work, jammed together in communities of cardboard and tin houses, with no running water or electricity, a sea of mud during the rainy season, sharing their bathing and toilet with the animal kingdom. Men on coffee plantations earning 20 cents or 50 cents a day, living in circumstances closely resembling concentration camps, looked upon by other Guatemalans more as beasts of burden than humans. A large plantation to sell, reads the advertisement, with 200 hectares and 300 Indians. This, then, was what remained of the ancient Mayas, whom the American archaeologist Sylvanus Morley had called the most splendid indigenous people on the planet. The worst was yet to come. We have seen how, in 1954, Guatemala's last reform government, the legally elected regime of Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown by the United States, and how, in 1960, nationalist elements of the Guatemalan military who were committed to slightly opening the door to change were summarily crushed by the CIA. Before long, the ever-accumulating discontent again issued forth in a desperate lunge for alleviation, this time in the form of a guerrilla movement, only to be thrown back by a Guatemalan-American operation reminiscent of the Spanish conquistadores in its barbarity. In the early years of the 1960s, the guerrilla movement, with several military officers of the abortive 1960 uprising prominent amongst the leadership, was slowly finding its way, organizing peasant support in the countryside, attacking an army outpost to gather arms, staging a kidnapping or bank robbery to raise money, trying to avoid direct armed clashes with the Guatemalan military. Recruitment amongst the peasants was painfully slow and difficult. People so drained by the daily struggle to remain alive have little left from which to draw courage. People so downtrodden scarcely believe they have the right to resist, much less can they entertain thoughts of success. As fervent Catholics, they tend to believe that their misery is a punishment from God for sinning. Some of the guerrilla leaders flirted with Communist Party and Trotskyist ideas and groups, falling prey to the usual factional splits and arguments. Eventually, no ideology or sentiment dominated the movement more than a commitment to the desperately needed program of land reform aborted by the 1954 coup. A simple desire for a more equitable society, and nationalist pride vis-a-vis the United States. New York Times correspondent Alan Howard, after interviewing guerrilla leader Luis Tercios, wrote, "Though he has suddenly found himself in a position of political leadership, Tercios is essentially a soldier fighting for a new code of honor. If he has an alter ego, it would not be Lenin or Mao or even Castro, whose works he has read and admires, but Augusto Sandino, the Nicaraguan general who fought the U.S. Marines sent to Nicaragua during the Coolidge and Hoover administrations." In March 1962, thousands of demonstrators took to the streets in protest against the economic policies, the deep-rooted corruption, and the electoral fraud of the government of General Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes. Initiated by students, the demonstrations soon picked up support from worker and peasant groups. Police and military forces eventually broke the back of the protests, but not before a series of violent confrontations and a general strike had taken place. The American military mission in Guatemala, permanently stationed there, saw and heard in this, as in the burgeoning guerrilla movement, only the omnipresent communist threat. As U.S. military equipment flowed in, American advisors began to prod a less alarmed and less than aggressive Guatemalan army to take appropriate measures. In May, the United States established a base designed specifically for counterinsurgency training. The Pentagon prefers the term counterinsurgency to counter-revolutionary because of the latter's awkward implications. Set up in the northeast province of Izabal, which, together with adjacent Zacapa province, constituted the area of heaviest guerrilla support, the installation was directed by a team of U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets, of Puerto Rican and Mexican descent to make the North American presence less conspicuous. The staff of the base was augmented by 15 Guatemalan officers trained in counterinsurgency at the U.S. School of the Americas at Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone. American counterinsurgency strategy is typically based on a carrot-and-stick philosophy. Accordingly, while the Guatemalan military were being taught techniques of ambush, booby traps, jungle survival, and search-and-destroy warfare, and provided with aircraft and pilot training, a program of civil action was begun in the northeast area. Some wells were built, medicines distributed, school lunches provided, etc., as well as promises of other benefits made, all aimed at stealing a bit of the guerrillas' thunder and reducing the peasants' motivation for furnishing support to them. And, with the added bonus of allowing American personnel to reconnoiter guerrilla territory under a non-military cover. Land reform, overwhelmingly the most pressing need in rural Guatemala, was not on the agenda. As matters were to materialize, the attempt at winning the hearts and minds of the peasants proved to be as futile in Guatemala as it was in Southeast Asia. When all the academic papers on social systems engineering were in, and all the counterinsurgency studies of the RAND Corporation and the other think tanks were said and done, the recourse was to terror, unadulterated, dependable terror. Guerrillas, peasants, students, labor leaders, and professional people were jailed or killed by the hundreds to put a halt, albeit temporarily, to the demands for reform. The worst was yet to come. In March 1963, General Adigueras, who had been elected in 1958 for a 6-year term, was overthrown in a coup by Colonel Enrique Peralta Azurdia. Veteran Latin American correspondent Georgie and Geyer later reported that top sources within the Kennedy administration have revealed the U.S. instigated and supported the 1963 coup. Already in disfavor with Washington due to several incidents, Adigueras apparently sealed his fate by allowing the return to Guatemala of one Jose Arevalo, who had led a reform government before Arbenz and still had a strong following. Adigueras was planning to step down in 1964, thus leaving the door open to an election and, like the Guatemalan army, Washington, including President Kennedy personally, believed that a free election would reinstate Arevalo to power in a government bent upon the same kind of reforms and independent foreign policy that had led the United States to overthrow Arbenz. Arevalo was the author of a book called The Shark and the Sardines, in which he pictured the U.S. as trying to dominate Latin America. But he had also publicly denounced Castro as a danger to the continent, a menace. The tone of the Peralta administration was characterized by one of its first acts, the murder of 8 political and trade union leaders, accomplished by driving over them with rock-laden trucks. Repressive and brutal as Peralta was, during his 3 years in power, U.S. military advisors felt that the government and the Guatemalan army still did not appreciate sufficiently the threat posed by the guerrillas, still were strangers to the world of unconventional warfare and the systematic methods needed to wipe out the guerrillas once and for all. Despite American urging, the army rarely made forays into the hills. Peralta, moreover, turned out to be somewhat of a nationalist who resented the excessive influence of the United States in Guatemala, particularly in his own sphere, the military. He refused insistent American offers of Green Beret troops trained in guerrilla warfare to fight the rebels, preferring to rely on his own men, and he restricted the number of Guatemalan officers permitted to participate in American training programs abroad. Thus it was that the United States gave its clear and firm backing to a civilian, one Julio Cesar Mendez Montenegro, in the election held in March 1966. Mendez won what passes for an election in Guatemala and granted the Americans the free hand they had been chafing at the bit for. He served another important function for the United States. As a civilian and one with genuine liberal credentials, Mendez could be pointed to by the Johnson administration as a response to human rights critics at home. However, whatever social conscience Julio Cesar Mendez may have harbored deep within, he was largely a captive of the Guatemalan army, and his administration far exceeded Peralta's in its cruelty. Yet the army did not trust this former law school professor. In the rarefied atmosphere of Guatemala, some military men regarded him as a communist, and on at least 2 occasions, the United States had to intervene to stifle a coup attempt against him. Within days after Mendez took office in July, U.S. Colonel John D. Weber, Jr. arrived in Guatemala to take command of the American military mission. Time magazine later described his role. Weber immediately expanded counterinsurgency training within Guatemala's 5,000-man army, brought in U.S. jeeps, trucks, communications equipment, and helicopters to give the army more firepower and mobility, and breathed new life into the Army's Civic Action Program. Towards the end of 1966, the Army was able to launch a major drive against the guerrilla strongholds. To aid in the drive, the Army also hired and armed local bands of civilian collaborators, licensed to kill peasants whom they considered guerrillas or potential guerrillas. There were those who doubted the wisdom of encouraging such measures in violence-prone Guatemala, but Weber was not among them. "That's the way this country is," he said. "The communists are using everything they have, including terror. and it must be met. The last was for home consumption. There was never any comparison between the two sides as to the quantity and cruelty of their terror, as well as in the choice of targets. With rare exceptions, the left attacked only legitimate political and military enemies, clear and culpable symbols of their foe, and they did not torture nor take vengeance against the families of their enemies. Two of the left's victims were John Weber himself and the U.S. naval attaché, assassinated in January 1968. A bulletin later issued by a guerrilla group stated that the assassinations had brought to justice the Yankee officers who were teaching tactics to the Guatemalan army for its war against the people. In the period October 1966 to March 1968, Amnesty International estimated somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 Guatemalans were killed by the police, the military right-wing death squads, often the police or military in civilian clothes, carrying out atrocities too bloody for the government to claim credit for, and assorted groups of civilian anti-communist vigilantes. By 1972, the number of their victims was estimated at 13,000. For years later, the count exceeded 20,000, murdered or disappeared without a trace. In the Gualan area, it was said no one fished anymore. Too many corpses were caught in the nets, decapitated corpses or castrated or pins stuck in the eyes. A village rounded up, suspected of supplying the guerrillas with men or food or information. All adult males taken away in front of their families, never to be seen again. Or everyone massacred, the village bulldozed over to cover the traces. Seldom were the victims actual members of a guerrilla band. One method of torture consisted of putting a hood filled with insecticide over the head of the victim. There was also electric shock. To the genital area is the most effective. In those days, it was administered by using military field telephones hooked up to small generators. The United States supplied the equipment and the instructions for use to several countries, including South Vietnam, where the large-scale counterinsurgency operation was producing new methods and devices for extracting information from uncooperative prisoners. Some of these techniques were finding their way to Latin America. The Green Berets taught their Guatemalan trainees various methods of interrogation, but they were not solely classroom warriors. Their presence in the countryside was reported frequently, accompanying Guatemalan soldiers into battle areas. The line separating the advisory role from the combat role is often a matter of public relations. Thomas and Marjorie Melville, American Catholic missionaries in Guatemala from the mid-1950s until the end of 1967, have written that Colonel Weber made no secret of the fact that it was his idea, and at his instigation that the technique of counterterror had been implemented by the Guatemalan army in the Zacapa and Izabal areas. The Melvilles wrote also of Major Bernard Westphal of Iowa City, who perished in September 1967 in the crash of a Guatemalan Air Force jet that he was piloting alone. The official notices stated that the U.S. airman was testing the airplane. That statement may have been true, but it is also true that it was a common and public topic of conversation at Guatemala's La Aurora Air Base that the major often tested Guatemalan aircraft in strafing and bombing runs against guerrilla encampments in the Northeastern Territory. F-51D fighter planes modified by the United States for use against guerrillas in Guatemala. After modification, the planes are capable of patrolling for 5 hours over a limited area, equipped with 6.50 caliber machine guns and wing mountings for bombs, napalm, and 5-inch air-to-ground rockets. The napalm falls on villages, on precious crops, on people. American pilots take off from Panama, deliver loads of napalm on targets suspected of being guerrilla refuges, and return to Panama. The napalm explodes like fireworks, and a mass of brilliant red foam spreads over the land, incinerating all that falls in its way. Cedars and pines are burned down to the roots, animals grilled, the earth scorched. The guerrillas will not have this place for a sanctuary any longer, nor will they or anyone else derive food from it. Halfway around the world in Vietnam, there is an instant replay. In Vietnam, they were called free fire zones. In Guatemala, zonas libres. Large areas of the country have been declared off limits and then subjected to heavy bombing. Reconnaissance planes using advanced photographic techniques fly over suspected guerrilla country, and jet planes, assigned to specific areas, can be called in within minutes to kill anything that moves on the ground. The military guys who do this are like serial killers. If Jeffrey Dahmer had been in Guatemala, he would be a general by now. In Guatemala City, right-wing terrorists machine gun people and houses in full light of day journalists, lawyers, students, teachers, trade unionists, members of opposition parties, anyone who helped or expressed sympathy for the rebel cause, anyone with a vaguely leftist political association or a moderate criticism of government policy. Relatives of the victims, guilty of kinship common criminals, eliminated to purify the society, taken from jails and shot. See a communist, kill a communist, the slogan of the new anti-communist organization. An informer with hooded face accompanies the police along a city street or into the countryside, pointing people out, who shall live and who shall die. This one's a son of a bitch. That one? Men found dead with their eyes gouged out, their testicles in their mouth, without hands or tongues, women with breasts cut off. There is rarely a witness to a killing, even when people are dragged from their homes at high noon and executed in the street. A relative will choose exile rather than take the matter to the authorities. The government joins the family in mourning the victim. One of the death squads, Mano Blanca, White Hand, sent a death warning to a student leader. Former American Marinol priest Blase Bonpain has written, "I went alone to visit the head of the Mano Blanca and asked him why he was going to kill this lad. At first he denied sending the letter, but after a bit of discussion with him and his first assistant, the assistant said, 'Well, I know he's a communist, and so we're going to kill him.' 'How do you know?' I asked. He said, 'I know he's a communist because I heard him say he would give his life for the poor.'" Mano Blanca distributed leaflets in residential areas suggesting that doors of left-wingers be marked with a black cross. In November 1967, when the American ambassador, John Gordon Maine, presented the Guatemalan armed forces with new armored vehicles, grenade launchers, training and radio equipment, and several HE-1B jet-powered helicopters, he publicly stated, "These articles, especially the helicopters, are not easy to obtain at this time since they are being utilized by our forces in defense of the cause of liberty in other parts of the world, i.e. Southeast Asia. But liberty must be defended wherever it is threatened, and that liberty is now being threatened in Guatemala." In August 1968, a young French woman, Michelle Kirk, shot herself in Guatemala City as the police came to her room to make inquiries. In her notebook, Michelle had written, "It is hard to find the words to express the state of putrefaction that exists in Guatemala and the permanent terror in which the inhabitants live. Everyday bodies are pulled out of the Motagua River, riddled with bullets and partially eaten by fish. Everyday men are kidnapped right in the street by unidentified people in cars, armed to the teeth, with no intervention by the police patrols. The U.S. Agency for International Development Aid, its Office of Public Safety, OPS, and the Alliance for Progress were all there to lend a helping hand. These organizations, with their reassuring names, all contributed to a program to greatly expand the size of Guatemala's national police force and develop it into a professionalized body skilled at counteracting urban disorder. Senior police officers and technicians were sent for training at the Inter-American Police Academy in Panama, replaced in 1964 by the International Police Academy in Washington, at a federal school in Los Fresnos, Texas, where they were taught how to construct and use a variety of explosive devices, see Uruguay chapter, and other educational establishments, their instructors often being CIA officers operating under OPS cover. This was also the case with OPS officers stationed in Guatemala to advise local police commands and provide in-country training for rank-and-file policemen. At times, these American officers participated directly in interrogating political prisoners, took part in polygraph operations, and accompanied the police on anti-drug patrols. Additionally, the Guatemala City Police Force was completely supplied with radio patrol cars and a radio communications network, and funds were provided to build a national police academy and pay for salaries, uniforms, weapons, and riot control equipment. The glue which held this package together was the standard OPS classroom tutelage, similar to that given the military, which imparted the insight that communists, primarily of the Cuban variety, were behind all the unrest in Guatemala. The students were further advised to stay out of politics. That is, support whatever pro-US regime happens to be in power. Also standard was the advice to use minimum force and to cultivate good community relations. But the behavior of the police and military students in practice was so far removed from this that continued American involvement with these forces over a period of decades makes this advice appear to be little more than a self-serving statement for the record, the familiar bureaucratic maxim, cover your ass. According to AID, by 1970, Over 30,000 Guatemalan police personnel had received OPS training in Guatemala alone, one of the largest OPS programs in Latin America. At one time, many aid field offices were infiltrated from top to bottom with CIA people, disclosed John Gilligan, director of aid during the Carter administration. The idea was to plant operatives in every kind of activity we had overseas, government, volunteer, religious, every kind. By the end of 1968, the counterinsurgency campaign had all but wiped out the guerrilla movement by thwarting the rebels' ability to operate openly and casually in rural areas as they had been accustomed to, and, through sheer terrorization of villagers, isolating the guerrillas from their bases of support in the countryside. It had been an unequal match. By Pentagon standards, it had been a limited war, due to the absence of a large and overt U.S. combat force. At the same time, this had provided the American media and public with the illusion of their country's non-involvement. However, as one observer has noted, in the lexicon of counter-revolutionaries, these wars are limited only in their consequences for the intervening power. For the people and country under assault, they are total. Not until 1976 did another serious guerrilla movement arise, the Guatemalan Army of the Poor, EGP, by name. Meanwhile, others vented their frustration through urban warfare in the face of government violence, which reached a new high during 1970 and 1971 under a state of siege imposed by the president, Colonel Carlos Arana Osorio. Arana, who had been close to the U.S. military since serving as Guatemalan military attaché in Washington, and then as commander of the counterinsurgency operation in Zacapa, where his commitment to his work earned him the title of the Butcher of Zacapa, decreed to himself virtually unlimited power to curb opposition of any stripe. Amnesty International later stated that Guatemalan sources, including the Committee of the Relatives of Disappeared Persons, claimed that over 7,000 persons disappeared or were found dead in these 2 years. Foreign diplomats in Guatemala City, reported Le Monde in 1971, believe that for every political assassination by left-wing revolutionaries, 15 murders are committed by right-wing fanatics. During a curfew so draconian that even ambulances, doctors, and fire engines reportedly were forbidden outside, as American police cars and paddy wagons patrolled the streets day and night, and American helicopters buzzed overhead, the United States saw fit to provide further technical assistance and equipment to initiate a reorganization of Arana's police forces to make them yet more efficient. In response to a question from a congressional investigator in 1971 as to what he conceived his job to be, a member of the U.S. military group MILGP in Guatemala replied instantly that it was to make the Guatemalan armed forces as efficient as possible. The next question as to why this was in the interest of the United States was followed by a long silence while he reflected on a point which had apparently never occurred to him. As for the wretched of Guatemala's earth, in 1976 a major earthquake shook the land, taking over 20,000 lives, largely of the poor whose houses were the first to crumble. The story was reported of the American church relief worker who arrived to help the victims. He was shocked at their appearance and their living conditions. Then he was informed that he was not in the earthquake area, that what he was seeing was normal. The level of pesticide spraying is the highest in the world, reported the New York Times in 1977, and little concern is shown for the people who live near the cotton fields. 30 or 40 people a day are treated for pesticide poisoning in season. Death can come within hours, or a longer-lasting liver malfunction. The amounts of DDT in mother's milk in Guatemala are the highest in the Western world. It's very simple, explained a cotton planter. More insecticide means more cotton. Fewer insects mean higher profits. In an attack, guerrillas destroyed 22 crop duster planes. The planes were quickly replaced thanks to the genius of American industry. And all the pesticide you could ever want, from Monsanto Chemical Company of St. Louis and Guatemala City. During the Carter presidency, in response to human rights abuses in Guatemala and other countries, several pieces of congressional legislation were passed which attempted to curtail military and economic aid to those nations. In the years preceding, similar prohibitions regarding aid to Guatemala had been enacted into law. The efficacy of these laws can be measured by their number. In any event, the embargoes were never meant to be more than partial, and Guatemala also received weapons and military equipment from Israel, at least part of which was covertly underwritten by Washington. As further camouflage, some of the training of Guatemala's security forces was reportedly maintained by transferring it to clandestine sites in Chile and Argentina. Testimony of an Indian woman. My name is Rigoberta Menchutum. I am a representative of the Vincente Menchu, her father revolutionary Christians. On December 9th, 1979, my 16-year-old brother Patricino was captured and tortured for several days, and then taken with 20 other young men to the square in Chagil. An officer of President Lucas Garcia's army of murderers ordered the prisoners to be paraded in a line. Then he started to insult and threaten the inhabitants of the village, who were forced to come out of their houses to witness the event. I was with my mother, and we saw Patricino. He had had his tongue cut out and his toes cut off. The officer Jackal made a speech. Every time he paused, the soldiers beat the Indian prisoners. When he finished his ranting, the bodies of my brother and the other prisoners were swollen, bloody, unrecognizable. It was monstrous, but they were still alive. They were thrown on the ground and drenched with gasoline. The soldiers set fire to the wretched bodies with torches, and the captain laughed like a hyena and forced the inhabitants of Chagil to watch. This was his objective, that they should be terrified and witness the punishment given to the guerrillas. In 1992, Rigoberta Menchutum was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Testimony of Fred Sherwood, CIA pilot during the overthrow of the Arbenz government in 1954, who settled in Guatemala and became president of the American Chamber of Commerce. Speaking in Guatemala, September 1980, why should we be worried about the death squads? They're bumping off the commies, our enemies. I give them more power. Hell, I'd get some cartridges if I could, and everyone else would too. Why should we criticize them? The death squad. I'm for it. Shit. There's no question we can't wait till Reagan gets in. We hope Carter falls in the ocean real quick. We all feel that Reagan, is our savior. The Movement for National Liberation, MLN, was a prominent political party. It was the principal party in the Irana regime. An excerpt from a radio broadcast in 1980 by the head of the party, Mario Sandoval Alarcón. I admit that the MLN is the party of organized violence. Organized violence is vigor, just as organized color is scenery and organized sound is harmony. There is nothing wrong with organized violence. It is vigor, and the MLN is a vigorous movement. Mario Sandoval Alarcón and former President Arana, the butcher of Zacapa, spent inaugural week mingling with the stars of the Reagan Inner Circle, reported syndicated columnist Jack Anderson. Sandoval, who had worked closely with the CIA in the overthrow of Arbenz, announced that he had met with Reagan defense and foreign policy advisors even before the election. Right-wing Guatemalan leaders were elated by Reagan's victory. They looked forward to a resumption of the hand-in-glove relationship between American and Guatemalan security teams and businessmen, which had existed before Carter took office. Before that could take place, however, the Reagan administration first had to soften the attitude of Congress about this thing called human rights. In March 1981, 2 months after Reagan's inaugural, Secretary of State Alexander Haig told a congressional committee that there was a Soviet hit list for the ultimate takeover of Central America. It was a 4-phased operation, of which the first part had been the seizure of Nicaragua. Next, warned Haig, is El Salvador, to be followed by Honduras and Guatemala. This was the kind of intelligence information which one would expect to derive from a captured secret document or KGB defector. But neither one of these was produced or mentioned, nor did any of the assembled congressmen presume to raise the matter. 2 months later, General Vernon Walters, former deputy director of the CIA, on a visit to Guatemala as Haig's special emissary, was moved to proclaim that the United States hoped to help the Guatemalan government defend peace and liberty. During this period, Guatemalan security forces, official and unofficial, massacred at least 2,000 peasants, accompanied by the usual syndrome of torture, mutilation, and decapitation, destroyed several villages, assassinated 76 officials of the opposition Christian Democratic Party, scores of trade unionists, and at least 6 Catholic priests. August 19, 1981, unidentified gunmen occupied the town of San Miguel Academ, forced the mayor to give them a list of all those who had contributed funds for the building of a school, pick out 15 from the list, including 3 of the mayor's children, make them dig their own graves and shoot them. In December, Ronald Reagan finally spoke out against government repression. He denounced Poland for crushing by brute force the stirrings of liberty. Our government and those of our allies have expressed moral revulsion at the police-state tactics of Poland's oppressors. Using the loopholes in the congressional legislation, both real and loosely interpreted, the Reagan administration, in its first 2 years, chipped away at the spirit of the embargo. $3.1 million of jeeps and trucks, $4 million of helicopter spare parts, $6.3 million of other military supplies. These were amongst the publicly announced aid shipments. What was transpiring covertly can only be guessed at in light of certain disclosures. Jack Anderson revealed in August 1981 that the United States was using Cuban exiles to train security forces in Guatemala. In this operation, Anderson wrote, the CIA had arranged for secret training in the finer points of assassination. The following year, it was reported that the Green Berets had been instructing Guatemalan army officers for over 2 years in the finer points of warfare. And in 1983, we learned that in the previous 2 years, Guatemala's Air Force helicopter fleet had somehow increased from 8 to 27, all of them American-made, and that Guatemalan officers were once again being trained at the U.S. School of the Americas in Panama. In March 1982, a coup put General Efren Rios Montt, a born-again Christian, in power. A month later, the Reagan administration announced that it perceived signs of an improvement in the state of human rights in the country and took the occasion to justify a shipment of military aid. On the 1st of July, Rios Montt announced a state of siege. It was to last more than 8 months. In his first 6 months in power, 2,600 Indians and peasants were massacred, while during his 17-month reign, more than 400 villages were brutally wiped off the map. In December 1982, Ronald Reagan, also a Christian, went to see for himself. After meeting with Rios Montt, Reagan, referring to the allegations of extensive human rights abuses, declared that the Guatemalan leader was receiving a bad deal. Statement by the Guatemalan Army of the Poor, made in 1981, by which time the toll of people murdered by the government since 1954 had reached at least the 60,000 mark, and the sons of one-time death squad members were now killing the sons of the Indians killed by their fathers. The Guatemalan Revolution is entering its 3rd decade. Ever since the government of Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown in 1954, the majority of the Guatemalan people have been seeking a way to move the country towards solving the same problems which were present then and have only worsened over time. The counter-revolution, put in motion by the U.S. government and those domestic sectors committed to retaining every single one of their privileges, dispersed and disorganized the popular and democratic forces. However, it did not resolve any of the problems which had first given rise to demands for economic, social, and political change. These demands have been raised again and again in the last quarter century, by any means that seemed appropriate at the time, and have received each time the same repressive response as in 1954. Statement by Father Thomas Melville, 1968. Having come to the conclusion that the actual state of violence, composed of the malnutrition, ignorance, sickness, and hunger of the vast majority of the Guatemalan population, is the direct result of a capitalist system that makes the defenseless Indian compete against the powerful and well-armed landowner, my brother Father Arthur Melville, and I decided not to be silent accomplices of the mass murder that this system generates. We began teaching the Indians that no one will defend their rights if they do not defend themselves. If the government and oligarchy are using arms to maintain them in their position of misery, then they have the obligation to take up arms and defend their God-given right to be men. We were accused of being communists along with the people who listened to us, and were asked to leave the country by our religious superiors and the U.S. Ambassador John Gordon Main. We did so, but I say here that I am a communist only if Christ was a communist. I did what I did and will continue to do so because of the teachings of Christ and not because of Marx or Lenin. And I say here too, that we are many more than the hierarchy and the U.S. government think. When the fight breaks out more in the open, let the world know that we do it not for Russia, not for China, nor any other country, but for Guatemala. Our response to the present situation is not because we have read either Marx or Lenin, but because we have read the New Testament. Postscript, a small sample, 1988. Guatemala continues to suffer the worst record of human rights abuses in Latin America, stated the Council on Hemispheric Affairs in its annual report on human rights in the Western Hemisphere. 1990. Guatemalan soldiers at the army base in Santiago Atitlan opened fire on unarmed townspeople carrying white flags, killing 14 and wounding 24. The people had come with their mayor to speak to the military commander about repeated harassment from the soldiers. 1990. The United States, said to be disillusioned because of persistent corruption in the government of President Benicio Cerezo Arevalo, is reportedly turning to Guatemala's military to promote economic and political stability, even though the military is blamed for human rights abuses and is believed to be involved in drug trafficking. This was reported in May. In June, a prominent American businessman living in Guatemala, Michael Devine, was kidnapped and nearly beheaded by the Guatemalan military after he apparently stumbled upon the military's drug trafficking and/or other contraband activities. The Bush administration, in a show of public anger of the killing, cut off military aid to Guatemala, but we later learned, secretly allowed the CIA to provide millions of dollars to the military government to make up for the loss. The annual payments of $5 to $7 million apparently continued into the Clinton administration. 1992. In March, Guatemalan guerrilla leader Efren Bamaca Velasquez was captured and disappeared. For the next 3 years, his American wife, attorney Jennifer Harberry, waged an impassioned international campaign, including public fasts in Guatemala City, nearly to death, and in Washington, to pressure the Guatemalan and American governments for information about her husband's fate. Both governments insisted that they knew nothing. Finally, in March 1995, Rep. Robert Torricelli of the House Intelligence Committee revealed that Bamaca had been tortured and executed the same year of his capture, and that he, as well as Devine, had been murdered on the orders of Colonel Julio Roberto Alvarez, who had been on the CIA payroll for several years. Alvarez thus becoming another illustrious graduate of Fort Benning School of the Americas. The facts surrounding these cases were known early on by the CIA and by officials at the State Department and National Security Council at least a few months before the disclosure. Torricelli's announcement prompted several other Americans to come forward with tales of murder, rape, or torture of themselves or a relation at the hands of the Guatemalan military. Sister Diana Ortiz, a nun, related how in 1989 she was kidnapped, burned with cigarettes, raped repeatedly, and lowered into a pit full of corpses and rats. A fair-skinned man who spoke with an American accent seemed to be in charge, she said. 38 Costa Rica 1970 a 1971. Trying to topple an ally, Part 2. Jose Figueres, who headed the Costa Rican government 3 times, was always a rather improbable target of destabilization by the United States. He was a bona fide North Americaphile, fluent in English, educated at MIT, lecturer at Harvard and other American universities, well-connected in U.S. intellectual circles, particularly among Kennedyites, accorded an honorary membership in the Americans for Democratic Action. Figueres was typically referred to as an outstanding friend of the United States, and had long been associated with the CIA in a variety of activities and fronts in Latin America. And if that weren't enough, both of Figueres' wives had been American. Yet, the CIA tried to overthrow him during his term in office in the 1950s and twice tried to assassinate the man, see Costa Rica, mid-1950s chapter, and perhaps tried again to overthrow him in the 1970s. To liberal American political figures, Figueres was the quintessential liberal Democrat, the kind of statesman they liked to think and liked the world to think was the natural partner of U.S. foreign policy rather than the military dictators who somehow keep popping up as allies. To American conservatives, Figueres was of questionable ilk, the type that, if not actually a communist himself, doesn't sufficiently appreciate the nature and degree of the international communist conspiracy and consequently allows communists too much room to maneuver. It was the latter conviction that was stirred up by Figueres soon after becoming president again in May 1970. He began building bridges to the communist bloc, with Costa Rica becoming the first Central American country to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. This diplomatic recognition in no way shakes our loyalty to the United States or to the democratic cause, Figueres cautioned. People everywhere are tired of the Cold War. Russia controls half of Europe, and we want to make the Russians drink coffee, Costa Rica's principal export, instead of tea. In the previous 2 years, the Soviet Union had purchased $10 million worth of coffee from Costa Rica, an economic offensive which reportedly disturbed United States officials. Earl Ted Williamson, officially listed as First Secretary of the U.S. Embassy in San Jose, but actually CIA Chief of Station, was heard to declare at a party that the Figueres government would not last much longer. He spoke openly against the president's bridge-building endeavors. Williamson's comments got back to Costa Rican officials, as did reports of his close ties with Figueres' conservative political opponents, and indiscreet remarks made by his Cuban wife regarding the country's alleged march toward communism. Williamson, who had served in Cuba before the revolution and married the niece of a wealthy sugar baron, was also blamed for the seizure and burning of some Marxist literature coming in through the Costa Rican airport. The blame arose through his involvement in a CIA technical assistance program on security. By autumn, the Costa Rican government felt compelled to make an informal suggestion through the State Department's Costa Rican desk in Washington that Williamson be removed. The request was ignored. Then, on December 17th, a fisherman reported sighting a mysterious ship which had unloaded long wooden boxes on a remote Costa Rican beach. The ship was identified as the Waltham, and the Costa Rican government later received information that the vessel was registered to the commercial section of the State Department. This was never verified. However, the U.S. Commerce Department at that time did own a 455-foot vessel named the Waltham Victory. It was first reported that the boxes contained weapons. Subsequently, a story was circulated that it was contraband whiskey that had been put ashore. The Miami Herald, which had first broken this story, commented that the contraband story presumably was put out to dispel rumors of a coup against the government. America filed that Figueres was probably anxious to downplay the entire controversy, which must have been acutely embarrassing to him. 3 congressmen of his party, however, unencumbered by such loyalties, released a statement that accused the CIA of being involved in the ship movements and the alleged arms drop. By early January 1971, the Costa Rican government seriously feared an uprising. It again asked the Nixon administration to recall Williamson. Not long before, Williamson had publicly forecast that the Figueres government would not survive another 2 weeks. The Guardia Civil, Costa Rica's only armed force, was alerted, and plans were made to remove Figueres from the capital to a hiding place in the mountains. At Figueres' request, the Panama government covertly delivered over 100 semi-automatic rifles to Costa Rica. During this entire period, the American embassy in San Jose was reported to be deeply divided between liberals and conservatives. Perhaps the most conservative, along with Williamson, was Ambassador Walter Ploeser, a Nixon political appointee with a long history of ultra-anti-communist activity. Ploeser vehemently defended Williamson and was said to have made no effort to curb the CIA officials' public outbursts against Figueres. At the same time, Ploeser fired the director of the U.S. aid program in Costa Rica, Lawrence Harrison, who took a pro-Figueres stand. The 2 men reportedly clashed over priorities, with Ploeser wanting an increase in military assistance, although Costa Rica, ostensibly, had little use for such, and a reduction in American economic aid to the country. Official cables reaching Washington from Ploeser's embassy described the situation in Costa Rica as dangerous. Figueres was accused of abandoning the West and facing east, of having accepted financial assistance from the communists for his campaign, and of permitting communists to infiltrate his government. In February, Williamson was finally recalled by Washington. Costa Rican officials hoped and expected that Ploeser would be replaced as well, as soon as it could be done with the customary diplomatic face-saving. As it was, Ploeser lingered on at his post for a full year before resigning for personal reasons. The announcement of Williamson's departure was perhaps hastened by the fact that a few days earlier the House Subcommittee on Inter-American Affairs had held a briefing to look into the matter. But the congressmen were not about to become the authors of an expose. After hearing the testimony of 2 State Department officials, the committee announced that it had all been a big misunderstanding due to personality conflicts within the embassy, which had repercussions outside its walls, and overzealous actions by some U.S. officials who would remain nameless, as would everything else heard at the closed-door briefing. The same day, the Miami Herald stated in an editorial, "What is abundantly clear is the power and influence of the United States Embassy in a small country such as Costa Rica. An embassy that even quietly passes the word that it opposes the government can stimulate opposition and perhaps inspire efforts to overthrow it. Open antipathy almost asks for it. 39. Iraq 1972 to 1975. Covert action should not be confused with missionary work. Into the land of ancient Mesopotamia reached the long arm of the CIA and the Kurdish people of the Zagros and Taurus Mountains, but a few decades removed from the life of nomads, joined the agency's list of clients. In May of 1972, President Richard Nixon and his National Security Affairs advisor, Henry Kissinger, went to the Soviet Union to meet their Russian counterparts. Afterward, Kissinger told a press conference in Moscow that the two nations had agreed to defuse the tensions in the Middle East and to contribute what they can to bringing about a general settlement. Such a settlement would also contribute to a relaxation of the armaments race in that area. Speaking for our side, he added, "I can say we will attempt to implement these principles in the spirit in which they were promulgated." Kissinger and Nixon were moved by the spirit for perhaps 24 hours. On their way home, they stopped in Tehran to visit their friend, the Shah of Iran. It seems that Iran and Iraq were embroiled once again in their perennial feud, a border dispute and the like, and the Shah asked his pal Richard for a little favor. Could he help arm the Kurds in Iraq who were fighting for autonomy? Just generally heat things up so as to sap the Iraqi resources and distract them from Iran. Anything for a friend and loyal ally, said Richard Milhouse, 2 weeks before the Watergate burglary and still on top of the world. The Shah was quite capable of arming the Kurds himself, and in fact was doing so to some extent, but the Kurds didn't trust him. They trusted the United States and wanted to be armed by them. Several years later, the congressional committee known as the Pike Committee, which investigated various CIA operations, put it thusly: the U.S. acted in effect as a guarantor that the Kurds would not be summarily dropped by the Shah. Before long, the CIA was reaching into its warehouses, and a range of Soviet and Chinese small arms and rifles and millions of rounds of ammunition were on their way to the Kurdish rebels, the communist origin of the weapons being a standard means of ensuring the standard plausible denial. Ultimately, the military aid was to total some $16 million. The Kurds are a distinct ethnic group, Muslim but, unlike most other Iraqis, not Arab. Their people are to be found primarily in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. For decades, the Iraqi Kurds had been engaged in intermittent warfare against the government in pursuance of a goal of autonomy, a concept not terribly well defined by them, it being clear only that it fell short of being an independent state, perhaps. The political history of the Iraqi Kurds in their recent past was a baffling piece of patchwork. 10 years earlier, they had been in close alliance with the Iraqi Communist Party, such that when the ruling Ba'ath Party began to persecute the communists, they took refuge amongst the Kurds. The Kurdish leader, Mustafa al-Barzani, a man in his 70s, had spent a dozen years in the Soviet Union and spoke Russian. Now, in 1972, the communists were allies of the Ba'aths in an attempt to suppress the imperialist agent Barzani, and Kurdish propaganda emphasized Soviet military support of the Iraqi government, including claims that Russians were flying bombing missions against the Kurds. At the same time, the Kurds painted themselves as social democrats of the European variety, going so far as to apply for membership in the Socialist International. Nonetheless, Barzani stated frequently that he trusted no other major power than the United States and asserted that if his cause were successful, the Kurds were ready to become the 51st state. All this on top of desiring to establish a Muslim society. In October 1973, when the Yom Kippur surprise attack on Israel took place, and Iraq was preoccupied as an ally of Egypt and Syria, the Kurds were willing to launch a major attack at Israel's suggestion that might have been very beneficial to their own cause as well as taking some pressure off Israel by tying down the Iraqi army. But Kissinger refused to let the Kurds move. On October 16th, he had the CIA send them a cable which read, "We do not consider it advisable for you to undertake the offensive military actions that Israel has suggested to you." The Kurds obeyed. The Pike report regarded this incident as an example of the apparent no-win policy of the United States and Iran. The committee stated, "The progressively deteriorating position of the Kurds reflected the fact that none of the nations who were aiding them seriously desired that they realize their objective of an autonomous state." A CIA memo of March 22, 1974 states Iran's and the United States' position clearly. We would think that Iran would not look with favor on the establishment of a formalized autonomous government. Iran, like ourselves, has seen benefit in a stalemate situation in which Iraq is intrinsically weakened by the Kurds' refusal to relinquish their semi-autonomy. Neither Iran nor ourselves wish to see the matter resolved one way or the other. This policy, said the report, was not imparted to our clients, who were encouraged to continue fighting. Even in the context of covert action, ours was a cynical enterprise. The day after the CIA memo referred to above, March 23, 1974, Soviet Defense Minister Alishare Qerechok, who had befriended Barzani when the latter lived in the Soviet Union, arrived in Iraq to help the government reach a settlement with the Kurds. On the advice of Iran and the United States, however, Barzani refused to come to any terms. Earlier that month, the Iraqi government had actually passed a law offering a limited amount of autonomy to the Kurds, but they had rejected that as well, whether or not at the request of their allies is not known. The Congressional Committee discovered that the CIA had early information which suggested that the Shah would abandon the Kurds the minute he came to an agreement with Iraq over border disputes. Agency documents characterized the Shah's view of the Kurds as a card to play in this dispute with Iraq, and a CIA memo characterized the Kurds as a uniquely useful tool for weakening Iraq's potential for international adventurism. The last may have been a reference to Iraq signing a pact of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union in April 1972, under which it received military aid and granted the Soviet Navy certain port privileges. Then, in June, super oil-rich Iraq had nationalized the Western-owned consortium, the Iraq Petroleum Company, 23.75% US, a move warmly applauded by the Soviets, after which the two countries proceeded to conclude a trade and economic accord, as it was oil that brought Iran and Iraq together. In 1973, the Shah wanted to strengthen Iran's position with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and a crucial part of the inducement to Iraq and other Arab neighbors was Iran's willingness to double-cross the troublesome Kurds. None of these countries wanted their own minorities to be getting any ideas from a Kurdish success. It was not until March 1975 that the Shah was ready to make his move. Events moved swiftly then. The Shah met with the Vice President of Iraq and, by agreement, the Shah cut off all supplies to the Kurds, including the American part. The next day, the Iraqis unleashed their biggest offensive ever. Several days later, the stunned Kurds sent a desperate message to the CIA. There is confusion and dismay among our people and forces, our people's fate in unprecedented danger, complete destruction hanging over our head. No explanation for all this. We appeal you and USG. United States government intervene according to your promises. The same day, the Kurds appealed to Kissinger as well. Your Excellency, having always believed in the peaceful solution of disputes, including those between Iran and Iraq, we are pleased to see that their two countries have come to some agreement. However, our hearts bleed to see that an immediate byproduct of their agreement is the destruction of our defenseless people. Our movement and people are being destroyed in an unbelievable way with silence from everyone. We feel, Your Excellency, that the United States has a moral and political responsibility towards our people who have committed themselves to your country's policy. The hapless Kurds received no response to their pleas from either the CIA or Henry Kissinger. By the end of the month, their forces had been decimated. Several hundred Kurdish leaders were executed. In conclusion, the Pike report noted, over 200,000 refugees managed to escape into Iran. Once there, however, neither the United States nor Iran extended adequate humanitarian assistance. In fact, Iran was later to forcibly return over 40,000 of the refugees, and the United States government refused to admit even one refugee into the United States by way of political asylum, even though they qualified for such admittance. When Henry Kissinger was interviewed by the staff of the Pike Committee about the United States' role in this melodrama, he responded with his now famous remark, "Covert action should not be confused with missionary work." 40. Australia 1973 to 1975. Another free election bites the dust. When the leader of a communist country was removed from office by the Politburo, this was confirmation to the Western mind of the totalitarian, or, at best, the arbitrary nature of the communist system. What then are we to make of the fact that in 1975 Edward Gough Whitlam, the legally elected Prime Minister of Australia, was summarily dismissed by a single non-elected individual, one functioning under the title of Governor-General. Whitlam took office in December 1972 as the head of the first Labour Party government in Australia in 23 years. In short order, he set about proving to the opposition parties the correctness of their historical prediction that Labour in power would be irresponsible and dangerous, to whom, of course, had always been the question. The war in Vietnam was an immediate example. Australian military personnel serving there under the command of the United States were called home, conscription was halted, and young men jailed for refusing military service were released. Moreover, the Whitlam government recognized North Vietnam. Several of his ministers publicly denounced American bombing of Hanoi and called for rallies to oppose it, and protesting dock workers felt inspired to impose a temporary boycott on American shipping, although the last was opposed by Whitlam. Condemnation of President Nixon and his administration volunteered by labor ministers was most undiplomatic. Corrupt, maniacs, mass murderers were some of the epithets hurled at Washington. American officials were reported to be shocked and angered. The overseas side of Australian intelligence, ASIS by acronym, it turned out, was working with the CIA in Chile against the Allende government. Whitlam ordered an immediate halt to the operation in early 1973, although at the time of Allende's downfall in September, ASIS was reportedly still working with the agency. The Labour government showed itself less than committed to the game security people play at home as well. Whitlam let it be known immediately that he did not wish to have his staff members undergo the usual security checks because he knew and trusted them. The Australian Security and Intelligence Organization, ASIO, was taken aback by such an orthodoxy and informed its CIA colleagues in Australia. Cables went to Washington. Before long, a political officer at the American Embassy was informing Richard Hall, one of Whitlam's advisors, "Your Prime Minister has just cut off one of his options." Hall took the remark to be a threat to cut off intelligence information. Whether bowing to American/ASIO pressure or not, Whitlam soon afterward agreed to the security checks. The new administration also put an end to the discrimination against immigrants who were being denied naturalization for having opposed the military juntas in places like Greece and Chile. Most exceptional and alarming to the security professionals was the behavior of the Attorney General, who showed up unannounced at ASIO headquarters one day in March 1973 with the police and carted away certain files because he suspected that the intelligence agency was withholding information from him. In all likelihood, ASIO was deliberately keeping certain information from its own government, as does every other intelligence agency in the world. The difference here, once again, was that the Labour government simply refused to accept such a state of affairs as normal. A few years later, after Whitlam's ouster, James Angleton, who had been a high CIA officer in 1973 and directly concerned with intelligence relations with Australia, complained to an Australian television interviewer about the Attorney General barging in, "We were deeply concerned as to the sanctity of this information which could compromise sources and methods and compromise human life. The CIA," he said, "seriously considered breaking intelligence relations with Australia." As a consequence of Whitlam's unconventional way of running a government, the CIA became rather concerned about the security and continued functioning of its many military and intelligence facilities in Australia. By the agency's standards, it was a highly important setup employing thousands of persons, a vital part of the early warning system, a key tracking station in the United States global spy satellite system of extremely sophisticated photography and monitoring of activities within the Soviet Union, a U.S. naval communications station which dealt with nuclear submarines, a huge electronics control center set up by the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, to intercept messages of voice, telex, etc., coming in and out of Australia and its Pacific region, that is, eavesdropping on everybody and everything. Most of this had been built in the latter part of the 1960s and was run